Welcome back, webheads, as we get into our latest episode of Spidey Swing-Bys. Amazing Spider-Man #2 is what we'll be covering today. I'm your host, Christian Ashley, as we continue on through the series of just exploring Spider-Man and all of his appearances in chronological release order. We're now on Amazing Spider-Man 2, and as you can see on my screen there it is. So thank you all for the listens and the subscribing we've got from this. I really appreciate it. As you continue to help Systematic Geekology with this, like we do appreciate everything you do. Just keep liking these videos and commenting down below to see, hey, what you like, what you don't like, what you want us to change. Now, if I sound a little different tonight, now I don't know if I sound if I'm being heard at all because I'm in a new audio setup. So if that has been messed up at all, I apologize, and maybe I'll have to re-record this. Who knows? We'll work it out. Whatever happens, happens. So with that in mind, we'll be going through, as we always do, the specifics of the writing, the colorists, and so excuse me, the uh, goodness gracious, why can I not think of words tonight? The pencilers and so on and so forth, as well as what's going to be happening in Marvel since this last happened. So we are now at Amazing Spider-Man 2. This is in week 7 in 1963. The release date of this specific issue was February 12th, 1963. Story 1, because we are splitting into 2 stories this time, is Duel to the Death with the Vulture, and Story 2 is The Uncanny Threat of the Terrible Tinkerer. Now, this specific issue was written by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, penciled by Steve Ditko, inked by Steve Ditko, lettered by John Duffy and Artie Simak, and edited by Stan Lee. So what else was happening in Marvel this month? Well, in this month of February 1963, in Journey into Mystery 91, Thor is menaced by the Loki-empowered Sandu. You know him. He's been in all the MCU films. Big Sandu guys out there. I know you're all Sandu heads. You really want him? Well, you get to see his first appearance there, and I think he appears maybe once or twice after this. A lot of memorable villains we've been seeing so far in this early Marvel era, which is quite ironic considering that we're talking about one of Spidey's oldest villains here who has stood the test of time. Most of his young villains, not young villains, the original villains do stand that test. But in Tales to Astonish number 43, we see Ant-Man as he must face the unforgettable menace of the Time Master before he dies of old age. And I think this is one of the only Time Master appearances we get. So there's that. Good old Ant-Man and the rest, just stopping their villains from causing havoc in the world. But on to actual good villains and anti-heroes, we get into Fantastic Four number 14. We see the Fantastic Four being menaced by a puppet master controlled Namor the Submariner. That's actually a really fun issue. You guys would check it out if you can. And then we go down to Strange Tales number 108, which is frankly, in my opinions, and we will eventually get to Strange Tales Annual number 2, which is a Spidey and the Torture's first real beginnings of their friendship later on. Strange Tales just kind of sucks. To be perfectly honest, it is not my favorite. The villains are forgettable. The stories are forgettable. Johnny is just kind of like whatever in his own series. So what is he doing this week? He's facing off against the painter and the artwork he brings to life. So it has him facing off against the FF and like this art form brought to life kind of battle. And last but not least, we have Tales of Suspense number 41, where Iron Man duels who else but Doctor Strange. But not that one because he hasn't been invented that. This is Doctor Strange of the very beginnings of this early Marvel. He is, like many of these early ones, kind of forgettable, not worth your time. So, getting into the issue proper, why don't we go ahead and see what happens as we start with the menace of the Vulture. And as we see here, the Vulture is flying around the city and comes upon this poor, hapless man who's got his entire fortune in bonds. I'm not. I don't understand the economy. I don't understand how banks work. Like I'm the last person who should ever be asking questions like this. But did people back in the '60s typically do that? Obviously, there's not the computerization we have today. Did they have to physically do this to go from bank to bank, or did they carry it after they had a dealing with the bank? So, regardless, Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, who I don't remember if he's actually named in this issue, swings down. We see and a very unique, in this sense, villain of an older gentleman who in this garish 60s costume that itself has stood the test of time as well, with the kinda like the white mane and the green, which, I can't remember how what was it the primary colors and secondary colors were how you got your villains and heroes back in the day when it came to artwork, and, I mean, he's rocking it, stealing this guy's entire fortune in bonds. And, the people are reacting like, "Oh my gosh, the vulture, he just swooped in out of nowhere and stole this guy's money." But they're not the only ones concerned with him. We have good old JJJ, who is immensely concerned. His Now magazine, which is, separate from the Daily Bugle, because he does own multiple things here, uh, he wants specifically this magazine to get the scoop on the Vulture, and also will keep printing stories about Spider-Man. He'll never rest until that dangerous menace is destroyed. I can't say it over and over again, but I just mean it. I mean it. I love J. Jonah Jameson and his one man crusade against masked superheroes. It just tickles me every time. And it's just done, it's over the top. Sometimes it's done really well, but right here it's what I want. But we'll go over to Peter, who has, in the midst of his science class, is just doing his own experiment there and is actually overhearing his fellow classmates who he's still trying to get close to them in his own real aloof, introverted kind of way. But they're reading the magazine because what else did hip kids in the 60s do? They read magazines in the middle of their science classes. the, the teacher probably just didn't care and moved on with their life. So, and they talk about how, J.J. Jameson is offering money for photos of the vultures. So Peter's like, oh, well, we're having money issues. I could totally do that too. So why don't I attempt to do that? And we go over here to our boy Flash Thompson, who is called Moose here. I don't know if that's supposed to be like an Archie reference or something. I'm not an Archie guy, but he's not called Flash. He is called Flash later on in the second story we get here. But uh that is just teasing Peter relentlessly. Is like, that bookworm. Just take a look at what's happening in the real world. And as a result of doing that, Peter has neglected his experiment. This very, very small, minor scene that has no bearing whatsoever on the rest of the story, but it's a moment of levity provided by Ditko and Lee of him getting the dollar signs in his mind while neglecting the science experiment to his right. So what does he do? He goes over to Aunt May and she gives him a miniature camera that was once his Uncle Ben's. And it's such a sweet moment. Once again, this is only one panel in the comic, and it's done extremely well here. I really appreciate what is happening with this in don't have means right now. They're wrestling with bills, but what is Aunt May still doing? She's looking after her favorite nephew, giving him something that belonged to the man, her husband who died, who has no children of his own. Like, what does she do? She gives it to her nephew. So what does Spider-Man do? He's got to figure out a way to integrate that into his costume so he can test out the camera for the first time. Really extremely well done there. I can't praise those panels enough. Like they're getting the job done. So we go over to the Vulture, and there's this shipment of gems, which in the news, which once again I don't understand newspapers, so maybe they would say, "Hey guys, this armored truck's coming into town today." It's I don't know, to warn the criminals about what's going to happen. Who knows? But as he goes around, he has this abandoned silo in Staten Island that he uses as his base of operations. Which I don't know if that ever gets picked up again or something like that. It's just this weird detail that's probably a Leeism. I don't know. Maybe Ditko obviously drew this first, and using the Marvel method, Lee was like, okay, well, there's a silo here. So, yep, abandoned silo in Staten Island. And he flies to Manhattan. Spider-Man happens to see him along the way as he's on his, as the Vulture is on his way to deliver these addressed messages to J. Jonah Jameson, I guess because he was written about in the magazine. He also gives it to the radio network, which I mean, that's obviously a topical reference because we don't use the radio as much anymore. So if this was written today, it'd be like maybe a major television program along the way. And he also gives it to the chief of police just to like rub it in their noses, like, haha, I'm going to steal this and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Which, classic villain move. Love it. It's great when they do this. So we didn't see Spider Man stumble upon him. So he attempts to go after him. But as he's taking the pictures, we have this weird scene where the vulture is able to fly around him. The vulture has kind of noted earlier about how like no one's figured out the technology that I use to fly like this because obviously a man cannot put on wings like this and then fly. That's just not how things work. But we'll get there later on. It's classic Marvel science, but it is makes enough sense given what's going on here. So I'll also remember the scene here where we see the vulture kicking Spider-Man in the back of the head. What you notice something that isn't there? Something that kind of warns him about danger, maybe a certain danger sense, maybe a spider sense, we could call it. Well, that doesn't happen in this panel, but remember that because well, this exact same scene plays out later on. So, bit of a convenience here, but we can argue that this is young Peter. He's still learning his powers; they're not in full control yet. So, I'm not going to harp on it too much. And what does the vulture do? Well, instead of outright killing an unconscious Spider-Man, he just puts him in a water tower uh, to drown him. So Peter does wake up in the midst of this and goes, "Oh no, uh, this isn't good. I can't find my way out of here." And his webbing doesn't work. It's too slippery for him to climb, which later on is something that he would be getting a little better at. So I'm okay with this early, like him not able to do this like with his spider powers because it kind of gets in that whole. He's still figuring things out. He's just not as good. He doesn't have the extra webbing he would normally have. So what does he do? He uses science to his advantage, which does is a great way to showcase that brain of his. He goes down, gets the leverage he needs, pushes himself up, and he gets out of the water tower, saving himself when the vulture could have just outright killed him. But also, he has plot armor, so don't worry about it. It's just fine. It's where we need to be. So Peter, still trying to get the money for the pictures, tries to make some containers on his belt to make additional places for where he can hold his web shooters and his web fluid for the web shooters. Like, this is good. Like, this is a young hero who doesn't really understand what's going on yet, who's figuring things out. As in, oh, I almost died because I didn't have enough. Let me be better. Extremely well done scene here. And then after that, he does tire and gets the pictures that he does have to Jameson, and he specifies, like, hey, um, I will give you these pictures. I will take the money. Just never ask how I got them. Which Jameson's like, yeah, whatever. I mean, I'm going to make more money than I'm going to pay you. Which is another great and terrible part of their relationship is just how much of a cheapskate he is to someone who's giving him a lot of good stuff here, some quality picks that no one else could get because they're not Spider-Man. So the next day, um, everyone else they've heard in the news that the vulture's going to go to this diamond exchange, this jewelry exchange, and they've all got to watch it. That's what the hip kids were doing back in the day. They would just go to these scenarios. Uh, I guess they read their newspapers back in the day. Like, I'm not going to complain too much about it. I always find it funny how Stan and Steve would handle the youth of that day, obviously being men who that had been way behind them at this point in time. So they go on and they've got news crews there trying to figure things out. And I got to that image a little early, but that's okay. And I'm wondering, how is the vulture going to make good on his promise? Like, they're looking at the sky, there's no one there. So what does he do as the money is being taken away? They've got a police escort, guns going. They step near a manhole. The vulture pops out and steals the money. Was that on your bingo cards for how this would get solved? I think probably not. So there we go. And he's made his escape through the very vast and wondrous sewer network of New York, which I think for the super networks in the world, this is probably still going to be one of the largest. I've never been down there myself when I've been to New York before, so I have no reason to say it's impossible for these to be as spacious as they are for an old man in a green suit to fly through it with these giant wings as he leaves the subway tunnel. Sure. So Peter, seeing as this has happened, goes into action to try and find the vulture and bring him to justice and to get a little revenge too for how he was placed in this uh, water tower earlier. Vulture notices that he's following him, so he does what he did earlier, flies to where Spider-Man can't hear him, and he also can't hear him because of the special anti-gravity device that Vulture has on his person that allows him flight. But Spider-Man, having learned from the scenario, and imagine that his spider sense works this time, so he jumps out of the way, prevents himself from being attacked, and then goes after the Vulture and uses a gadget of his own that he had built earlier, having recognized how the Vulture is able to do what he does and stops the villain in his tracks, leaving him to be captured by the police and snaps a good old picture there to for Jolly Jonah for his magazine, the most important magazine in the world, Now Magazine, which has a handful of appearances later on. It's very different from Woman Magazine or whatever it was called in Miss Marvel when Carol Danvers does take a job at the Bugle in her first solo series. Uh, but you see, Jameson, he's a very multifaceted man. He does a lot of things. But with this, Peter has finally been able to get the pictures that he needs even more and has gotten a profit for doing his job using superheroics in a way that wasn't grandstanding, in a way that didn't bring dishonor to anyone or himself or cause him to slip up. He just continues like, hey, just don't ask my secret. Now, Jameson pays him, and he's able to bring the money to good old Aunt May. And the vulture we see in prison in full costume, which is something that will continue on through Marvel, is that sometimes they just leave the villains in their costume for no good reason. And he vows that he will develop a flying power that Spider-Man cannot overcome. So will the Vulture return? Yes, we'll get there eventually. Now we go to the second story here in Amazing Spider-Man number 2, and that is the when he fights the Tinkerer for the first time. So going over there, we see that Peter's, a teacher, maybe Dr. Warren. I can't remember what we established earlier. Oh, I've remembered something I forgot to mention earlier. Is when that whole thing about Flash being called Moose. Now maybe that was Stan Lee forgetting something because in Amazing Spider-Man 1, in some of the narration, Peter Parker is written as Peter Palmer, and I completely forgot to mention that last time. It's just one of those things like one of the reasons Stan would always give his characters alliteration in their names was so that it would help him remember them a lot better because he was writing however many stories a month and he kept putting more and more on himself. So it was a lot easier to go, oh, it starts with a P, this starts with a P, oh, Peter Parker. But sometimes, as noted in that, he screwed up. So Peter Palmer, his first appearance is in Amazing Spider-Man 1. So there we go. So I'm going to say Warren here. So he is talking to Peter about how, hey, he's my best top science student here. And we have Professor Cobwell here who has asked him to, because he needs someone to help with his research. This is obviously something Peter is super interested in. He gets to learn from someone who's really great at it. Like when Dr. Octopus comes along, that's one of the things that kind of gets brought in, excuse me, is this idea of Peter being fascinated with him and what he's able to do because he's already studied him before. And it's always nice to see a super genius like that be, shown the appropriate love and respect from someone who naturally would have liked something they've done. So Cobwell, I don't know if he ever appears again. I'd have to look that up. But for right now, he serves as our uh, not MacGuffin. We'll just say our reason for why the story events Spider-Man ends up stumbling upon them. And of course, Peter gets dissed by Flash for being teacher's pet, which as their journey develops, I love. the rivalry between the two of them as Peter starts getting a little more machismo, a little bit more of standing up for himself, and Flash, who is always bullied and always looked down on him, like how does he handle that? And like how does he grow as a character too? Like at this point, he's more of a one note. I'm just a school bully. I'm just better than you. I'm good at football, blah, blah, blah. And it gets so much better along the way. But going back to Peter, when he does leave, he is careful to place his Spider Man outfit underneath his clothes because this going to be one of the great staples of his story is that they're light enough for him and tiny enough for him to put under his regular clothes. So when he needs to change, he's already in the suit. So Peter has been asked by Cobwell to pick up a radio at the Tinkerer repair shop, where he meets good old Tinkerer, who is another old man who is evil. Uh, as opposed to the Vulture, his evil is much different. He's not physically fit enough to fly around, but what can he do? As Peter's spider sense does go off. It's like, what's going on here? We don't know, but we see down below that the Tinkerer is working with some aliens. Some typical 60s aliens, um, who, if you're reading early Marvel, I'm actually kind of surprised. Outside of like the Journey into Mystery 83 we talked about, I don't think we talked too much about how much Marvel relied on alien invasions along with, the commies and science gone to run amok. This would be another big one they would use. It says, the Hulk would fight the Toad Men from blah blah blah. Thor would fight the Stone Men from Saturn or whatever it was, and Journey into Mystery 83. Here's another example of that, which will get retconned much later on in like Spectacular Spider-Man 61 or something like that. And in an additional retcon, we find out that these people are not aliens. They are humans in some convoluted scheme to appear like an alien invasion has happened so they can make some money. And among them are some actors. And one of those actors is Quentin Beck, Mysterio, who we will see later on, who does not appear himself until Amazing Spider-Man 13. So obviously this is not what Stan and Steve had in mind, but later writers would retcon this because the general consensus being in most fans' minds is that, hey, Spider-Man doesn't like a down-to-earth crime-fighting person. Not that those stories can never happen because he does amazingly in them, but that shouldn't be like something that happens this early. We need to establish him more as like the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, not the Spider-Man who fights global threats. I get the points, but there we go. They have this whole scheme where they're putting extra things in these devices to, wreak havoc and make some money is eventually the retcon along the way. So Peter goes up to the Tinkerer, and as he's trying to do things himself, later on at Dr. Cobwell's lab, his spider sense starts going out. And he's wondering what is possible about that. So Dr. Cobwell leaves, and Peter, in some good ingenuity on his own side, decides to investigate the device and finds, oh, there's something extra in here. So that doesn't belong. So he goes back to the Tinkerer shop and realizes that there are people down below, and he finds the alien menace there. And it seems the Tinkerer himself is one of these aliens. That is also something that's going to get retconned way later on. He's just, well, no, excuse me, no. Depending on who's writing, I think in this one he's just like a collaborator, more likely. I'm getting my stories mixed up. I apologize. So what does he do? Spider-Man sneaks upon the situation. Someone notices he's there. Spider-Sense warns him. He gets out of the way. He fights against the aliens. They overwhelm him with numbers for a little bit, and the Tinkerer hits him in the back as he's distracted and stuns him. So what do they do instead of just shooting him? They put him in this weird contraption that will just eventually kill him as the air is released from the Resisto glass prison. Classic Marvel nonsense word. Stan staple. The man, that's what he does. And I'm all here for it. But we get an explanation for how Peter's web launchers work. And he's able, through a very small hole here, to stop the machine, get himself out as he fights the aliens once more, goes after the Tinkerer for being a traitor. And in the midst of the fire, it looks like the two factions are fighting against one another. So Spider-Man just kind of gets out without actually confirming the events of what happens. And as a result, it looks like he's the one who starts the fire. So people naturally, as Peter does something that is good, puts himself in a situation to where he can't be what's the word I'm looking for here? He can't really be trusted because they have no context for what's going on. The people, all they're hearing is from Jameson. It's like Spider-Man's a threat. He's a menace. So of course, in their minds, oh, he started the fire. So the aliens leave. Um, Peter comes back and has fixed everything for Dr. Cobwell, and who says, "Oh, I swear I saw a big old spaceship," and it's like, "Oh, you're just being silly." Classic, the knee slapper humor. As we see that Peter has found the mask of the Tinkerer, who is hinted at also being an alien as well. It's all over the place. It's a mess. It's fun. It's it's 60s Marvel. It's not. I don't know. Should I start doing ratings for these? That's something if I'd have thought about that earlier, I would have definitely added that to like, hey, what is my personal rating? That way I could just look at it and go, okay, instead of being like in the heat of the moment, give a rating. So for this first story, maybe an 8.5 out of 10, maybe a 9 if I'm feeling extra good about it. This story, it's like a 5.5 out of 10. There's nothing evil about it. There's nothing like, "Ugh, this is terrible." It doesn't fit Spider-Man well early on, but s- Stan and Steve are figuring out what works. They're throwing things at the wall. Okay, this doesn't work. This doesn't work. And in our next issue, Spider-Man 3, we'll see if there's something that really works. I'm looking forward to that one. So, what do you guys think? Uh, is there anything I missed that you really wished I had talked about on this show? Is there something you're looking forward to in Amazing Spider-Man number 3? Uh, what else should I be talking about here? Just let me know in the comments below what you're liking, what you don't like, what you want fixed, what should stay the same. I'm really appreciative of all you guys do. So until next time, webheads,